let's get started. So the first topic for this week is obviously the big geopolitical news of the week, which is the Biden-Putin summit. I don't know if you want to give a bit of background for us, Clay, and then maybe I can add to that as well.
Yeah, so I would say the short-term backdrop of this summit was in response to the Russian military troop buildup in the Donbass region earlier this year. Russia had built up roughly 120,000 troops and military equipment in the region of Donbass, which is by Ukraine. It's where there's been a lot of fighting between pro-Russian separatists forces, Russian forces, and Ukrainian military forces, and that was the backdrop of this summit. Biden had just flown over to Europe to have the G7 meeting before going to meet with Putin, and so the topics were the situation in Donbass as well as the more recent Russian-backed hacking of the Colonial Pipeline in the U.S. as well as the JBS meatpacker company. And I would say the larger sort of backdropping of this conversation is obviously the 2018 or 2019 Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin. And so it was under that backdrop which the two leaders met in Geneva. They were supposed to talk to each other for about 4 to 6 hours. I believe their meeting went on for about 3 to 4. They kind of got to this point where they talked about everything that they wanted to, and they held two separate press conferences afterwards. Normally at these leader summits, they tend to hold joint press conferences. That's something that the Biden team didn't want to do, apparently. And yeah, I would say that is the backdrop of this meeting that happened. Ross, I was wondering what you thought about the meeting and what your sort of expectations were for the meeting going into it.
Um, Again, those two are quite hard to answer for me because I really didn't know what to expect. What I thought would happen and what I expected to happen are two kind of separate things. I kind of didn't expect anything really. I didn't know what would happen. They obviously Putin said that Russia-US relations are at their lowest point. I think he meant since the end of the Cold War, and going into this summit, I didn't know what to expect. Whether Biden was going to take a harder line. I mean, you probably could have read between the lines if you researched into it a bit further. But yeah, I kind of expected it to go a bit. I don't know what the word to use is. Maybe a bit more rude. Maybe there was
More aggressive, perhaps,
yeah,
more negative towards one each other, kind of like how the Chinese American summit back
yeah,
in what December? No, it would have been in like February of this year over in Alaska.
yeah,
Is that where that one was?
yeah. That was it.
Yeah, because that had very sort of sharp words between the two, and you definitely got that a little bit in this. Putin before the summit did an interview with NBC News that we were talking about beforehand, uh, and he obviously attacked the U.S. and did a lot of whataboutism when it came to some human rights questions that I believe it was Lester Holt that no, someone else, but whoever was doing the interview, Putin did that, and then afterwards in the post summit too, but it was fairly restrained in terms of language going into the summit. Biden was saying that Russia is this great power. It's a worthy country. Putin's smart and bright and meant to be taken seriously. I think their assessment that it's the worst relations between U.S. and Russia since the end of the Cold War is probably accurate. Immediately after the fall of the Cold War, very sort of accommodating between Yeltsin and the rest, and then even the transition over to Putin at the start of the Bush years was very positive. That obviously started to get worse around 2007, 2008, and then you had the Obama Russia reset in 2013, 2014, just before the Russo-Ukrainian War.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, it's pretty much a low point with the Cold War towards the end, huge spike up in terms of quality of relations, and then it's been sort of trending down ever since. I thought it was very much, in IR we talk about different theories. Very much it seemed like Biden took a very realist approach to this situation. Human rights were mentioned, but not really. More so like don't have Navalny die, don't do assassinations. But that was really about it when it came to the human rights part of the discussion. It was much more on the practical matters of things. Uh, the biggest one, I think, was the sort of threat that Biden gave to Putin about hacking. Of how would you feel if the infrastructure for Russian natural gas was hacked and taken down? It's a very interesting threat. It'll be interesting to see if that's something that the U.S. does or even can follow up on. You had today, in fact, Adam Schiff, House Democrat, on the head of the intelligence
Yeah, I think
panel,
you're right there.
I believe, in Congress,
Yeah.
who said the U.S. should take a more offensive cyber stance, which, we talked about that, I think, last week and the week before, something that we think the U.S. should do if it could. I have doubts on the U.S.'s superpowerness when it comes to cyber capabilities. I don't doubt that the U.S. is among the strongest, but I don't think the differential in terms of U.S. cyber capabilities is the same as their material military craft. But I would say that was probably the biggest one, is stopping of the cyber attacks and the sort of asking for more predictable behavior between the two states. I would say Russia, with the big Donbass increase, was going away from predictable geopolitical behavior. Um, so those
Yeah.
were sort of my two takes away from the
No,
summit.
I kind of, yeah, I can see that as a good analysis. But yeah, I'll just pick up on what you said about predictability. I think Putin, in his interview with NBC, said about he wants stability and predictability. I think he said they were key components to international relations, geopolitics. But yeah, and then the reporter sort of turned it round on him and said, "To you've promoted instability in the world, have you not?" And then obviously he went to his whataboutism. He does like to do that. Particularly in this interview, I did notice that you're sort of saying about the US's role in Iraq and Libya. I think he pointed to Libya, which, I mean, he's in my opinion, he's not wrong, but it's not really an answer to the question, is it? I guess. Yeah, I can't remember what else I was going to say, but yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, he just kept saying, "What about the US?" and didn't answer. So
Yeah, I think really this summit, how I've seen other people view it, and just given how engaged or busy I am at this point, I sort of more default to other people's analyses, and I think it's potentially accurate that this summit is a lot of these summits are what was done during the summit, what was accomplished, what were the victory items that they can praise either together or back in their home countries. And it seemed like this summit is will be victorious based on where things are in 6 to 12 months. Uh, is like, was this successful in terms of not resetting relations, but sort of rebalancing the way in which the two countries act between one another? And, is the question is sort of, twofold. One is like, how does the U.S. manage Russia, but then how does the U.S. manage the Russia-China relationship as well? And I think, part of that, Biden on his way over to Russia didn't make a definitive statement about Ukraine coming into NATO and deflected and punted off that, which was obviously a pretty big signal to Russia. NATO enlargement was seen as this big concern. You're even getting that now, even within the sort of G7 nations, about questioning, what is NATO doing right now? They're now tackling climate and all of that. It's been a pretty rudderless organization since the end of the Cold War and trying to find its own purpose.
well, Putin
And
actually said, sorry to interrupt, in that interview, he said he doesn't understand why it still exists. He said it's a Cold War relic, and I mean, I kind of agree as well. I don't really see the point of it necessarily. It kind of strikes me, yeah, as a bit old. But yeah, carry on.
yeah, it seems old, and it also seems very large, right? Like, especially if you were to keep, as it keeps expanding, like, if you were to ask the average American, what is your desire to defend Germany, say, from an attack from Russians? It's probably even not going to be 50%, but it'll probably be close enough that when the event happens, that would be pushed over 50%, right? Like,
Yeah,
in abstract, people probably don't, but when the troops, start invading, I think that would change things in a different way. Does that exist with the U.S. population, with Ukraine, with
mm.
the sort of, former Soviet bloc countries? you know, and then if you're expanding it into that and you're saying, Article 5 is unequivocal, is that still a compelling deterrent as it keeps enlarging, right? There's a question of doesn't a NATO enlargement even make sense for each member state as well for their own security, um,
Yeah,
and I don't think that's been sufficiently answered um, when it comes to that. So it would be really interesting to see, if big if there, but if Putin responds relatively well to the summit, you know, maybe this is where relations kind of shift back and the US
yeah.
realizes that they can't afford Russia to deflect into China's orbit. I mean, that would be extremely, like if you're trying to view of like the different countries on the map right now, giving up
Yeah,
Russia in the current environment where Europe, especially Germany and some of the other countries, are less gung ho about this whole countering China.
I think
Um,
we talked about it last week. I talked about the reverse Nixon strategy, um,
mhm.
with pivoting to Russia to counter China, and I said I think that's what's going to happen. Maybe I don't think this is the start of that, but I mean it could be a sort of starting point to build on that. Maybe if that was the objective of the US, but I don't think it is the objective of the Biden administration at all. I think Biden. We were talking about NATO. I think Biden's quite a big fan of NATO, isn't he? He's very much a NATO man, and he wants to. I think he kind of wants he kind of not to normalise things, perhaps how they were before 2014. If you catch my drift,
Mhm.
just sort of the world running on autopilot kind of thing with the US in charge. But I don't know how feasible that is with China, sort of not necessarily coming out of nowhere, but it's sort of a big silent giant, isn't it? And it's starting to become more vocal now that it's got the hard power and the soft power there.
Yeah, I think, and a large part of the whole silent giant, I think, is people really struggle to understand how like compounding growth works, right? Like if China grows at 6 to 10% a year and the US grows at 2 to 4, even if the US has a gap, that quickly drifts. Even at the start, if it doesn't seem like, the two are getting closer, eventually this one just curves up and, well passes the other. And I think that's just a general human cognitive flaw is struggling with that sort of numerical understanding. I mean, we do that. Andrew and I do that at globalguessing.com all the time when it comes to forecasting, and even we struggle with extrapolating out long-term growths and how that'll actually affect like power differentials down the line. And I think that was done in large part with China. And because of that, you say Biden might not want that with Russia, and that's probably true. The question is, in 4 years, does the U.S. have a compelling enough carrot to draw Russia in versus China in 4 years? Perhaps China, given a much more willingness to overlook any human rights at all. If I bet, Xi and Putin meet, there's probably not even a comment about Alexei Navalny at all.
No,
Um, and so, how does that affect things? I don't know. It seems like a lot of time U.S. politicians don't understand the concept of time. The fact that like if we don't do a thing, that doesn't mean other countries aren't doing things either. And so if the U.S. isn't courting Russia, but China actively is, and they're accomplishing things. So I don't even know if relations between the two are in a 1970s Nixon can go to China and open things up, or if
no.
we're in like a very 50s, early 60s relationship between Russia and China, but just the roles are flipped. In which case, there's basically no sort of hope right there.
I think you're right. I think yeah, the chances of Biden flipping Russia against China, are very low. As you say, the relations just aren't there for that to happen. That would probably be a couple of decades talking there to improve things to that level. I guess maybe more, maybe less. I'm not sure, but yeah, it
And
doesn't.
if it's a couple decades, is that even gonna like that probably doesn't then matter in terms of this current U.S. China
Yeah,
I feel like in 2 decades or even 1 decade, it'll be relatively clear which way it's gonna go. It won't be definitive who's gonna win, but it'll probably be 80-20 in terms of which country just has their stuff together and is putting together a more compelling domestic, but then also international ecosystem that other countries can participate in. Um,
I think it's good we're talking about China here because I think Russia, on its own is not really a threat. necessarily.
To the west.
Yeah, in a kinetic sense, in a nuclear sense, definitely. Uh, I don't know whether to talk about in a political sense. Maybe they supposedly interfered in the U.S. election and they've propped up candidates in various European countries. I think there was a scandal in Austria with different Russian something or other, money or something. And I think Le Pen in France is more friendly towards Russia and stuff. But I really do think you have to view Russia in the context of China now. Um, I think Russia and China together is a huge. We say this all the time. Said this multiple times on this podcast. Is a huge threat. Whereas if you took Russia away from China, they might not have the same. There'll be. It would be harder for China, put it that way. They don't have access to Russian gas. They don't have access. It will be harder for them to get involved in the Arctic. We've talked about before.
Russia has the Arctic. Russia has Europe.
Yeah,
Then combined, they have right Syria, um, Iran. I don't know if we'll talk about Iran, but we were talking about that before the show. But potentially Iran in that orbit. There's a lot of sort of middle powers coalescing into that China one that I think makes a more um, potent block than I think.
yeah,
If you just, if it's just, Russia, China, that's one thing. But Russia, China, you throw in Iran, Syria, it starts growing and becoming quite substantial.
and then
North
also,
Korea, right, in
yeah,
terms of like nuclear forces, that Russia, China, Iran, should they have a nuclear weapon, and North Korea might have a larger nuclear arsenal than U.S., Israel, UK, France. Germany doesn't have any nukes, do they?
no, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, but like, but between like the Western nuclear powers,
Yeah,
I think in that math they're about, equal.
well, I think maybe this we're talking on the subject of China and just what we're talking about there. I think Africa will be a battleground for that as well. I think that if the West, so the Western Bloc, as I like to call it now, it kind of reminds me of the Soviet bloc actually at the moment a bit. But yeah, that's another story. But I think if
Yeah, there was some map going around on Twitter recently that showed like different influences predominant in each one. And I think Africa was, if you looked in the past, obviously, well, it was originally all the former colonial powers and then the US, but I think China now has a predominance either in countries or population, or it's getting there. I'm
it's,
trying to look for the map.
it's massive influence in Africa, China, East Africa in particular. We were talking about Djibouti. Was it last week or the week before about the I can't remember. I think we might have been talking about maybe the UAE building the base or something like that. Or, but yeah, and the Chinese have their first overseas base in Djibouti, and they just took over the port there. I think there's a lot of. I was going to do a video on this, on talking about China and Djibouti, because there's quite a lot of fear that Djibouti has too much Chinese influence now. I don't know to what extent that's true, but it does seem as though China is sort of becoming very influential in Djibouti, which is the gateway to East Africa, pretty much, and the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia. I think Ethiopia is solely reliant on the Djiboutian port, and obviously Ethiopia is a big growing country, or was before the Tigray situation. I'm not sure how that's sort of playing out, and yeah, it just like China knows. Like it's the string of pearls theory again, like militarizing, in the well, not militarizing, but sort of maybe slightly a bit of militarizing, but moving into the Indian Ocean and surrounding India as well to the south with the port in Sri Lanka, Hambantota, I think it's called. But yeah, they're moving into Africa in a big way, East Africa in particular. I don't know about South Africa.
I sent you a map actually of,
Oh yeah,
of the different influences over time. I put it in Signal,
okay,
and so yeah, in 1980, Africa, predominantly France, UK, Germany, former colonial powers, a bit of US and Russian influence. Come 2000, it's about former colonial powers and US about even, and then China with some influence in the region. And now, if you look in 2020, I was saying it's about equal in terms of by country. China has the most influence out of any other country on the African continent. If you were to do it by GDP or population, taking a look at this graph, I think they would be more about equal, maybe even the U.S. It also depends most people count the Middle East as part of Asia, but depending on where you count that, it should be its own. Should make its own continent. I know tectonically it's not, but it
Yeah.
feels. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Looking at that map, you can really see the big shifts over time.
Surprising about Australia down there. Um, I don't know. Obviously, at the moment, there's a big hoo-ha about Australia and China.
But
But yeah.
but Australia's been taking the most anti sort of China.
Yeah, yeah. No, very much recent. I think that's very much a recent thing. There was a lot of Chinese money going into Australia, and a lot of there was influence. I think there was a big scandal about a Chinese asset in the running for the Australian Parliament or something, or was in the Australian Parliament. So, and then obviously with COVID, things have gone the 180, and there was the Chinese stopped importing coal from Australia and stuff as well. Yeah,
Also, I thought looking at the map, what's interesting is you see a slow loss but no gain of U.S. influence in Latin America as well as New Zealand, which
yeah,
we I think we talked before when we were talking about the Olympic boycott likelihood that Australia is more likely to go along with it if the Five Eyes were doing it than New Zealand. And I think this is another way of visualizing why that's the case, because New Zealand has fallen from the U.S.'s orbit into sort of nowhere. Uh, and if we're trying to think of Western countries to probably first be pulled into China's orbit, New Zealand's probably one of the first ones. If I'm making a forecast of which would be the first ones to side with China over the U.S. I don't know if
hundred
you have
percent,
that.
100%.
Okay.
Do we want to go back to the Russia summit? I think we've digressed a bit
Yeah,
there.
I mean, we should see if anyone in the comments has questions about the U.S. Or sorry, the Biden-Putin summit. Otherwise, we could. Um, I think we talked about that a fair amount, unless you have some more that you want to
I
talk
just
about.
wanted to maybe see what you thought about the arms control. Or there was talk
Hmm.
about START, wasn't there as well?
Yeah,
I
I
kind
wouldn't
of
be surprised if they were eventually to make some new agreement on START. It just doesn't feel they have so many different nuclear weapons and all of that. Like I see that as being sort of like an easy win for both of them as well, to show that they're smart, reasonable statesmen as well.
yeah. I kind of I'm not, just sort of before we moved on, we probably should move on to the next thing. I think we've talked quite a bit about it, but comparing it to the Trump years, it kind of seemed as though I kind of got the impression that perhaps because Trump had the accusation leveled at him that he worked with Russia to win, perhaps he overcompensated a bit while in office to sort of um, go against Russia and wanted to be seen as tough on Russia. And Biden doesn't have that pressure this time round, maybe, and maybe that's why. I can't remember exactly what the quotes were, but it sort of went well, didn't it? Supposedly, and they got on all right and stuff. Obviously, Putin and Trump got on, but I don't know. Like we talked about the Open Skies Treaty last week, didn't we? And sort of Trump was pulling out of stuff and de sort of picking apart the Cold War mentality that I think, maybe not Cold War, but Cold War slash post Cold War before 2014 thing. I don't know how to phrase it very well, but yeah, I don't know if you have any
Yeah, no,
thoughts.
I mean, Trump was rhetorically soft on Russia. When it comes to actions, he was tough on Russia. He probably wasn't as tough on Russia as Hillary Clinton would have been.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
she would definitely have been tougher than Joe Biden as well. And so I think, there was obviously a lot of acceptance on the Trump campaign for getting help from Russia, and Russia obviously wanted Trump over Hillary Clinton. But did it go to some sort of Tom Clancy conspiracy? At this point, the evidence is pointing towards no. And I think Trump, given a lot of different things, both personal, but then also systems with the U.S. establishment as well as the media, sort of led him to take a public line where it was very much, you know, Russia didn't intervene because he didn't want that to taint him as all. Um, I don't know about like open skies again. I'd be really interested to see like what like the concern is that like we're not in open skies anymore at this point. Perhaps it's just like now this is like another thing that might spiral off and cause extreme conflict between the two countries. I don't really know if that's as much of a concern in a world of instant communication, right?
No.
Even, 1980, you couldn't like live stream, here's our nuclear base. There's clearly nothing changing here, where in today's world, in theory, you can have that sort of instant level of verification. Um, but no, yeah, but I think we were talking about before. It'd be interesting to sort of reflect on the Trump era foreign policy and the strengths and weaknesses of it now that it's sort of in the rear view window and it's not being affected by the political conversations of the day as well.
Yeah, I think there's less domestic pressure on Biden on many issues, which probably gives him a bit more flexibility.
Yeah, although you wonder, does he has that when it comes to Russia, but probably not Ukraine, given all of the background. Although I haven't seen that risk sort of factor into his decision making. I think because the media in general doesn't talk about it, and so it's not really a constraint on him. But it could be, because in theory he has this, something there too. But
Yeah, in theory.